Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco, fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here, and am thrilled that we are able to host the fourth in a 7-part series of meetings on fisheries. Today's specific topic, globalized trade and macroeconomics of capture fisheries, is one that is obvious by the number of people in the room, has an awful lot of interest in it. And we are very fortunate to have three excellent presenters to help kick us off with substantive presentations, and then what I am certain will be a very substantive discussion. As some of you who are veterans of some of our past meetings know, this is a session that is done in collaboration with and with the support of USAID and EGAT and the fish folks, and it's terrific that Barbara Best and Richard Volk, and I know Heather Diagnos from Office of POP was scheduled to be here as well. They've been terrific in terms of partners and collaborators in conceptualizing this and helping it bring it to fruition. A word about where we're sitting. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the official memorial to Woodrow Wilson. He was our only president with a PhD, for better or for worse. And so instead of building an obelisk on the mall for us to all go look at night, we said, or the Congress said, not we, Congress said in 1968, let's set up a place where the scholar and the practitioner and the policymaker can come together and learn from one another, which is what we try to do with meetings like this, with an assortment of publications and a large fellowship program. And so we're thrilled to be able to continue this dialogue that, as you will see in the participants list, really does reflect this mix of private and public sector, practitioner, policymaker, advocate, and scholar. And so let me turn very quickly to our three speakers. You have longer bios along with the participants list, so I won't spend a lot of time on that and just introduce them very briefly so we have more time for them. We're going to start with Rashid Samaila, who is Associate Professor and Director of Fisheries Economics Research Unit at the University of British Columbia Fisheries Center, and so we're thrilled that he is here and has made a long trip to get here. David Shore is a Senior Fellow at World Wildlife US, an independent consultant based here in town, and has long experience at WWF working on these issues, and particularly looking at the economics of them. And then Karen Sack will be our discussant as Oceans Policy Advisor at Greenpeace International. Lots of experience on these issues, particularly in the UN fora. And so it's a thrill that she will be able to bring her insights as well. A short advertisement for the next session. We have some details to work out. We know it will be either April 10th or 11th. And we know the topic will be monitoring, control, and surveillance within a maritime security framework, with speakers yet to be confirmed. So I don't want to put names out there that we then can't deliver because of scheduling. We are taking March off, you will note, because of some of the scheduling conflicts. We figure it's more important to get the people we want and the right people we want for the discussions rather than just sticking to a strict time schedule. With that, I will turn the floor over to Rashid. One final note is to just say that we're broadcasting the event today live on the internet, and then the video will be archived, and we hope to have lots of resources, including a meeting summary and write-up, as well as some of the PowerPoints and such that you see presented today linked from that website, so you'll be able to share the insights from today's meeting with other colleagues who weren't able to be here. So I'll turn the floor over now to Rashid, and thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Center for inviting me to come and talk to a distinguished group like you, and thank you all for taking the time to come. Now I have to get to my talks here. Somebody to help?
I think let's just minimize this one, and would this one be it?
Yeah, let's kick on, yeah. Okay, try, okay.
Let's get rid of that cover slide, huh?
That's not mine. That's not mine. That's not, that's
okay. How about this one?
Yeah, that's it.
Excellent, okay.
Okay, so what I plan to do is to talk a little bit about globalization, fisheries subsidies, and also a bit about illegal fishing, which has come to be known as IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, and then link this to developments in coastal communities or coastal areas of developing countries. My goal will be to give you some broad picture, and then as the talk goes on, my colleagues will fill up with more detailed information. And also, I should note that this work actually is summarized from some of the work we do at the Fisheries Center in the Sea Around Us project and at the Fisheries Economic Research Unit. So this is summaries coming from all over. And what I intend to do quickly is to go through globalization and fish trade and talk about fishing access agreements with developing countries and try to frame this in terms of fisheries subsidies. And then I quickly give you a picture of illegal fishing globally and what it means to developing countries. And then leave you with a few points that I think if we put efforts on, we can at least make the situation in coastal communities in developing countries a little bit better, and also protect fish stocks and help to make them more sustainable. Now, a few definitions of globalization. This has been described as a process characterized by the trade of goods and services, leading to a less parochial world. That's interesting, right? So globalization leads to a less parochial world, which is nice. And now, key elements of globalization include the increase in flows of money, material, information, and people across national borders. And Stiglitz says that globalization leads to the removal of barriers to trade and the closer integration of national economies. So this is all about trade, opening up, people all over the world doing things together in the marketplace, in a sense. Now, people have actually argued for trade and globalization for a long time ago. In economics, we talk about the comparative advantage and specialization. The whole idea is if I'm good at doing something, I better do that, and then the things I'm not good at doing, other people do it. And so there's a gain there in trade. Both sides can benefit. So when it's done well, this is a good thing. Now, and others have argued that increasing wealth implies more spending on the environment. If you are richer, you are more likely to also be able to pay for good environment. Globalized organizations can help, and this is also a picture which is becoming more and more so, where you have, due to globalization, we have big organizations that look at things not locally or within countries, but thinking globally. And one of them is the World Trade Organization, WTO, and how it has been working recently to discipline subsidies, to try to reduce subsidies, mainly because of trade, but also has impacts on sustainability in the natural environment. Then there are advantages like the fusion of environmentally friendly technologies and practices. If one person or one institution in one country finds a better way of doing things, this can easily go through the world and therefore help in many ways. And this last point I put in there deals with modern communication and technology and how that can really help. I mean, the internet is amazing what it can do, right? These days, local researchers in small communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America can easily link up with what is happening in the world through the net. So that is a positive thing, and partly due to the globalization going on. But as always, there are negative sides to this also. People have argued that high production and consumption normally follows trade and globalization because people earn more incomes and therefore demand more, and that normally will lead to depletion or the use of more natural resources, especially in situations where management is very poor and weak. I mean, this is well established in the literature of trade and the environment. So the key thing is ineffective management. You know, when that is in place, this can lead to problems. Yeah. And then there's this thing about the race to the bottom where nations can start competing to get business and therefore keep on lowering the standard, environmental standard. You think about small nations in West Africa trying to sell fishing access rights to European Union, right? And each one competing to get this because hard currency is hard to come by, right? So you have a race to the bottom where the EU gets more than too much of a good deal, and that is to the detriment of the communities and to the fish stocks, if you like. In general, one big issue with trade is that the full cost of this trade is usually not internalized. You know, think of travel is a big one, where CO2 pumped out, the cost of that to the globe is not normally internalized, and this is a problem. Now, relating to developing countries and coastal communities in these places, you have the problem of weak bargaining power, where they're really weak in terms of negotiating for good deals. And I say both between developing and developed nations, and also within developing countries. Usually you have coastal communities being very weak economically and politically, and therefore the benefits of trade do not normally trickle down to them. Yeah. Now, a little bit of statistics on fish trade. Roughly about 40% of fish produce are exported. And if you compare this to wheat and rice, you see these are really, fish is highly traded. You have only 20% for wheat and 5% of rice is exported. Now, exports in 2000 they stood at about 26 million tons of products, worth about $55 million US. And imports were 27 million tons, worth about 61 million US dollars. In pictures, this is the kind of things you are seeing. So there is increasing growth in trade in marine fish products with time, as we can see here, both in terms of landings and in terms of value. Now, marine capture fish trade. Now, from now on, I'm going to split the trade into whitefish, demersal fish stocks, large pelagic, small pelagics, and invertebrates, just to give you a picture of how the trade trends have been. And this is all based on United Nations FAO commodities database. So this is from the United Nations FAO. And this is what you find in general, exports and percentage of landing of the various groups I mentioned. And in general, you see some increases with time. The values are like this. The invertebrates are really big here. And if you think in West Africa, you see that a lot of the invertebrates captured in West Africa are exported, partly for cultural reasons. People don't just like eating these fishes, so they send them out. And you see these trends. Exporters and importers of demersal fish. This is some interesting pictures I'll be showing you here. The red shows importing country, and the blue shows where the fish is captured, the EEZ from which the fish comes from. And you can see straight away that the importing countries are in the north. One can say that for the different species. And this is for demersal fish stocks. And this is data based on 83% of exported values that were available to us. Now, if you look at the other exporters and importers of small pelagic fish, this is also what you see. The one country that stands out in the south is Nigeria. And this is because Nigeria imports a lot of sardine, canned food, and iced fish, I mean, frozen fish, if you like. Otherwise, most of the fish comes from the Chile, Peru area there. Okay. Again, there's a movement, one can say, in general, from the south to the north. This is exporters and importers of large pelagic fish. Yeah, I think it still remains the same in terms of the movement of the fish. Invertebrates. That's the pattern. But the south also produces a lot of fish, if you look at it. The north produces a lot of fish. It's just that it's not enough to meet the demand. And so a lot has to come from the south. So the bottom line here from these pictures is that fish is imported from countries in the south to countries in the north. And the question is this good or bad? I will go a bit as we go into this question as I push through the talk. Now, let's move on to subsidies just for a moment. And here is a definition for you just to put things in place. Here I'm just looking at payments from governments or government entities to the fishing sector. That's the narrow definition of subsidies that is given here. And And then I say, okay, why are we concerned about subsidies? The key point is that it's the big amounts of money we're talking about, and it's usually these amounts are paid by the taxpayers. So whenever this is the case, you want to be sure that this is the right way to use the money, because there are many other ways that money could be spent, right? And these are estimates that have been given from time to time, with the FAO giving an estimate of 54 billion earlier in the early 70s, and then study by the World Bank, Milazzo is here, and then our recent study, we're talking about up to 34 billion US dollar subsidies going to the fishing sector from governments and government entities throughout the world to the fishing sector. Other reasons are that subsidies have socioeconomic, distributional, and trade impacts on fishing communities. I mean socioeconomic in the sense that money moves from one sector to the other, so you have these distributional effects, and the trade impacts. This is why the World Trade Organization is interested in this. So countries or communities can be disadvantaged if their competitors get free money from the government, and it has consequences. Now, the final point, which is very important, is that fisheries subsidies are also recognized as contributing to overfishing and therefore depletion of stocks, which is a big one. And this is basic economic 101 of fisheries subsidies. This kind of explains how subsidies impact. They go in to reduce the cost of fishing in most cases, or even to increase the price of fish, if that is the subsidy in there. And the tendency is to increase the profitability of fishing and therefore entice more fishers to come in. That's what is shown in the second panel there. All right. Now, we now move on to fishing access right, and this is connected to subsidies. And that's a part of subsidies I'm going to talk about in this talk. The fact that countries usually buy access rights for their fleet to go and fish in other nations, usually from rich nations. Rich nations buy this access right from developing countries and send their boats there. A typical example is West Africa. So what I have here, this picture is a study we did a few years ago, where we looked at the number of fishing access agreements that each country in West Africa has undergone with another part of the world to fish in their waters. So this is the picture in the 1960s and 1969, so decade out, just looking at one decade. There were 31 agreement years that were signed by West African nations and countries mostly from Europe, as you can see. And down in the corner here, you see the amount of fish they take here. So Asia, the Soviet bloc, and the EU were the main ones here, the agreement years. And then we go through the decades to see how this has changed. So this is what, by 1889, this is the number of agreement years, 111 were signed, and this is how the fish was distributed within the West African region. You can see the take by Africa there, huh? Can you see that? Yeah. So from 1960s to now, each decade there has been an increase in these access agreements. And there are subsidies because the governments pay for this, and usually the fishing companies don't pay back to the government. So it's a subsidy to them. Makes them more competitive and able to fish. In the 90s, this is what happened. It shot up to 185 agreement years. And these are the take-off there. So there has been a lot of this. And then the question you ask is, what is happening to the fishing communities who have long traditions, especially in the Gulf of Guinea area of fishing, whilst all this fishing effort is coming from outside? And what happens to the fish stocks themselves in terms of sustainability? In terms of sustainability, this is a picture that Ville Christensen developed through modeling, intensive modeling of the system in West Africa, the northern part of it. And this is what we find in the 1960s. This is This tells you the amount of fish in the ocean, right? The more hot the color, the more fish there is in there, and this is what you have today, according to this modeling, which is a huge modeling exercise, the best information available that we can get. So whilst all these agreements were being signed, the fish stocks were being depleted. That's what this says, partly because there's no good management and so on and so forth, too much competition and the like. And then talking about the community and what West Africa gains from this trade. This is a picture taken from a paper by Kaczynski and Fluharty from University of Washington, a paper they published in 2002. They analyze the total value of fish taken in Guinea-Bissau and the amount of this value that remains within Guinea-Bissau and that goes to the EU. And this is the ratio. Well, you can say 7% is not too bad, because this is the landed value, right? It's not the net revenue. So one can argue one way or the other, but clearly you can see that quite a lot of this goes out. And even the one that remains, this 7% is mostly the fees that are paid for the access to fish there. A very crucial point to note is that this 7% doesn't really get down to the fishing communities. It will mostly remain in the capital somewhere, right? So you leave the fishers, the communities, without their fish and without any dollars coming in. A big disaster kind of situation. So now I quickly move on. This is the only picture I'll show you in terms of IUU. This is a study we did and published in 2004, trying to put on a map where IUU fishing takes place, the incidence of IUU fishing based on our global database. And this is what we find. There's a lot taking place in the south, but most of the boats are actually not built in the south. You know, they come from the north for one reason or the other. They come in there. And there are estimates of the consequences of this to the fisheries in the developing world. EMRAG, this consultancy firm in the UK, I think they have a branch here in the US. They did a study in 2005, and what they found was that about 20% of the landed value of the fish in a number of sub-Saharan African countries was lost to IUU fishing, pirating and illegal fishing, about 20% of the landed value, which was about $370 million a year. And for these countries, that's a lot of money, you know. And recently, Indonesia, the Minister of Fisheries, I think, was on air talking about Indonesia losing up to $2 billion through IUU fishing. So that is also a big issue for developing countries. Yeah. Now, how do we try to help coastal developing country fishing communities? And I just put together a few points here. One, I think, is to try to improve the management institutions in these countries. I mean, the economic literature on trade and environment is very clear. If there is no good management, trade usually will lead to overfishing or overuse of the environment. So that's crucial. Research, knowledge about the fisheries are important. And another thing that is important is monitoring, control, and surveillance, trying to make sure only those who are entitled to fish their fish and they fish what they are entitled to take, not more than that. And this can be very expensive. I think one way to do it is to try to form joint regional kind of monitoring systems. And in Southern Africa, they're trying to do this, where you have Namibia, South Africa, Angola, and other smaller nations coming together to put together a management system to reduce the cost and make it more efficient. So that would be one way to try to help these countries. And the nice thing about it, in this region, in Southern Africa, they say that the benefit of this is even more than just protecting the fish. It also leads to cooperation at the political level, at many economic levels, and also. So this can really lead to very interesting cooperative work. The second point is to form regional bodies to help negotiate good deals with distant water fishing nations. If anyone can come up with good ideas on how to help these nations put them in a position to negotiate. And I think the Pacific Island states have been named as one small group of nations that have actually been able to do this pretty well, even facing up to big USA, right, and getting good deals, you know. So if we can replicate this in other regions of the world, that will be a good thing. And work with coastal communities to set aside marine protected areas. Given the lack of knowledge and scientific knowledge, given the lack of personnel at the moment, I think one way is to try to help these nations to hide away their fish from catching, at least until they know enough to be able to manage them. And MPAs will be one way, just as an insurance. Just keep them away for now whilst we work out how to deal with managing them properly. And my last point here is about education, and I'm really passionate about education because I think education could be a huge way to deal with problems in coastal communities in developing countries. Education and training, skill training. This can help people get off fishing and do other things. Maybe do some programming, you know, later. And education, I think, is really crucial. So if there's any way we can help improve the knowledge base in these communities, that will help reduce pressure and also increase quality of life and protect the environment. What do I have next? Acknowledgements. Thank you very much. That's there.
Good morning. Just give me 1 second to plug in here. Okay. So, good day. Thank you very much. I'm David Shore, and I'm here with my hat on as working for myself, but I'm also a senior fellow at WWF, where I've been involved in a lot of work on globalization and environmental law, as well as trade and fisheries law. And I'd like to start out by thanking the Center, the Wilson Center, and USAID for putting this together, and just to say that I was particularly relieved to get a phone call from somebody in USAID who was working to try to increase the profile and level of U.S. bilateral activity in the fisheries business, because if you're stomping around the world trying to find funding to improve management and sustainable development in fisheries, you can see that the U.S. is not nearly as well represented as it should be, and I think it's an excellent thing if USAID gets a little further into this business. I'm particularly grateful for that. I'm going to speak fairly generally about how trade law is or is not shaping the relationship between globalization and fisheries. And what I'm going to do is basically give you an overview of what I think are some of the key topics, and leave for the discussion a little bit some of the maybe more controversial details. I'll start off by saying that I think the key thing to remember when thinking about globalization and fisheries and trade law is three qualities of the status quo. And those three qualities are dwindling stocks. We have a genuine fisheries crisis, as Rashid has been telling us. Bloated fleets. We have way overcapacity fleets in many fisheries, particularly in developed countries, but also in some developing countries. And that means that we have a need for a serious industrial readjustment or transformation to get to a place where we have a balance between economic incentives and sustainability. And third, we have an extremely inequitable distribution of rents from fishing resources, skewed very heavily in favor of northern countries and away from developing countries, despite the fact that developing countries today are providing half or almost half of international trade, despite the fact that they are way more than half of the number of the hundreds of millions of people employed in fisheries. So dwindling stocks, bloated fleets, uneven rents, that's the status quo. As I'm going to argue, that status quo is partly reflected in the way the trade regime is set up now, partly, which means that there may be some stuff we can do within the trade regime to affect this. But one of the things that I think will be interesting to talk about, and I'm particularly looking forward to hearing Karen on this, is I want to start by drawing a sharp distinction between trade regulation on one hand and globalization as a phenomenon on the other. And I think you'll see that I'll make an argument that, yeah, there's a lot we can do in the trade area, but when you talk about the dangers of globalization to fisheries, when you talk about things like the dangers of export-driven growth in developing country fisheries, it's important to keep the policies and the institutions that seem to govern them a little bit separate, because it may be that we really need to attack much more the policies than we need to attack the structures like the WTO, and I'll come back to that later. Okay, so here are the 6 basic topics, and I'm not going to go through these in much detail because we don't have that much time, but how the rules of globalization affect the 3 things that I said before: bloated fleets, depleted stocks, and uneven rents. And the 6 topics, I'll just go through them quickly, are defining trade in fish products. And this is going to turn out to be very important, and you'll see why in a minute. But there's a big difference between how the apparatus for governing globalization defines trade in fish and what really happens. And that disjunction is going to be important. I'll talk very briefly about tariffs and quotas, rules to limit trade. Are they affecting the 3 topics that I mentioned? I'll also come to fisheries subsidies to talk about how the trade rules may or may not be able to affect this problem that Rashid was talking about. And then more quickly, I'm just going to go through the last 3, some of the rules for protecting consumers, how those affect the 3 values I was talking about. Trade measures for environmental purposes, I'll mention the famous tuna dolphin case and things like that. And then a little bit on eco-labeling. But really, this is just going to be sort of the highlights. So let's talk about trade in fish products for a minute. If you look at sort of what you would expect, trade is usually when somebody who owns something sells it across an international boundary to somebody who buys it, right? So we have to kind of ask who owns the fish to start with if you want to talk about what trade means technically. And if you want the answer to that, you basically go to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And, I'll offend every international UNCLOS lawyer in the room by saying in one sentence what it says. It says that in your territorial sea, which is your sea out to 12 nautical miles, you've got absolute sovereignty over your fish. An international environmental lawyer might take some issue with the idea that it's absolute, but that's more or less what UNCLOS says. And then from 12 nautical miles out to 200 nautical miles is your exclusive economic zone, where you have you have the sovereign right to enjoy the benefits of those fish, but you don't totally own them. You also have the obligation to let other people come and fish them if you can't, and to maintain them in a sustainable manner. So you have the right to enjoy them, but not the right to own them quite like you do. So the basic expectation is that if it's in your EEZ, it's your fish. And international policymakers tend much more to concentrate on the rights that UNCLOS gives them, the right to have the fish, than on the duties that it gives them, which is the obligation to maintain them sustainably. So that's the expectation. Now, if you were talking about the ordinary rules of trade law, that would sort of be your expectation too, because what the ordinary rules of trade law define who owns things in a set of rules called the rules of origin. These are the rules that when a product arrives at a customs point at a border, and they have to figure out where did it come from, because they need to know whether to put the really high tariff on it because we hate it because those lousy communists produced it, or the really low tariff on it because our best friends produced it. They have to know where it came from. So ownership is defined under trade law under these things called the rules of origin. But the rules of origin do not work out as you would expect them to work in the fish business. The normal rules of origin are that If you produced it entirely in your country, that's where it came from. And if you produced it internationally, if there was an international process, where some of it was produced over here and then it went over there to be put together, then the prevailing trade law rule is the rule of last substantial transformation, which is a very technical topic, but which basically says that the last country where something happened to the product that turned it into a kind of distinctly different product, that's the place where the rules of origin attach. Now, none of this really holds true in defining trade in fish. The fishy rules are a combination of what's called the flag state rule and a desperate desire by some countries to avoid application of the rule of least substantial transformation. And this is going to have a big impact on who gets rich selling fish. So the flag state rule is an old rule that says the nationality of a fish belongs to the flag of the country whose flag flies over the vessel that catches it. Wherever that happens in the world, whether it happens on the high seas, whether it happens in the territorial seas of the flag country, or whether it happens in somebody else's territorial sea. If a U.S. vessel catches a fish, the fish is, boom, a U.S. product. Okay? And UNCLOS does not do anything about that. If you go into somebody else's EEZ and you catch a fish, it belongs to your nation. So that's number one. What does that mean? That means if you have all these access agreements and a distant water fleet goes to somebody else's EEZ and fishes a whole lot of fish there and then takes those fish back to their own country, those fish never enter international trade. Right? And when you look at all the statistics on international trade, you have to remember that it doesn't include all the fish that is caught by foreign flag vessels and brought back to their own country. And to the extent that fish that is caught by foreign flag vessels are reflected in international trade statistics, it's only when they sell them to somebody else. So if a European vessel goes into Senegalese waters, fishes a fish, and sells it to Senegal, that's an export from the European Union to Senegal. Okay? Next, what if they sell it to Senegal in raw form, and Senegal puts it in a can, and then so they take tuna and they can it. Now, under the rule of least substantial transformation, that would ordinarily make that canned tuna a product of Senegal, because clearly tuna fish in a can is very different from tuna fish not in a can, right? But, in fact, in many relationships that exist, including U.S. import laws, including European import laws, the rule of least substantial transformation is often suspended in the case of exports from developing countries. And the reason this has happened is because they're suspended, and I should say, when I'm talking about trade law, I didn't give you my standard wrap on there are 1,000 sources of trade law, but some of the stuff I'm talking about is rules that exist in the WTO. Some of it is stuff that exists at the national level. Some of it is stuff that comes in regional trade agreements. And the things I'm talking about now tend to be in regional trade agreements. So Europe goes out and makes a regional trade agreement with Senegal and its brethren, and it gives all sorts of special rights to them as developing countries to ship stuff duty-free into Europe. But when they do that, they limit very carefully which products are allowed to get that duty-free right. And in order to limit which products get that duty-free right, they put a big exception to the last substantial transformation rule, including overfish. So Senegal basically isn't able to turn the fish into their own fish for purposes of export under regional agreements, which govern most of their exports. What is the consequence of all this? The EEZs for fish really belong to those who mine them, not those who own them. And number two, the ability of developing countries in particular to enjoy value added by processing fish from their own EEZs and then re-exporting it is sharply limited. The only way that a developing country, for example, under a standard regional agreement with Europe, can export canned tuna to Europe is if the ship that it came off of was a European-owned and European-operated or Senegalese-operated vessel. So the fundamental deal is most developing countries can sell their value-added fish to developed countries if that fish is mined by them or by the developing country that's giving them special access. But they're not allowed to shop around and get somebody like, let's say, just to pick a name out of the hat, the Chinese fleet, to come in, fish their fish at a much lower price than the EEZ, let them can it and sell it in competition with the EEZ producers. So it sharply reduces the ability of developing countries to compete with their sort of particularly with their traditional colonial masters. Let me put it in that gentle way. Okay, this is a very high priority. Rules of origin, this crazy word, is a very high priority in the trade negotiations that are taking place between Europe and its African, Caribbean, and Pacific trade partners. And so if you want to talk about what the balance, how globalization really affects who gets to fish and who has to maintain them, rules of origin in regional trade agreements is one of the keys. Okay. I'm going to talk very briefly about access agreements. Rashid referred to them. Are they necessary evils? You have the right under UNCLOS, under the law of the sea, to invite people into your EEZ and to charge them for access to your fish and to let them fish it. Not only do you have the right, under the law of the sea, it is arguable you have the obligation. If you don't have the ability to fish all of the fish in your EEZ, UNCLOS says you're really supposed to let other people come in and do it, and you're supposed to give priority to landlocked countries. How do you like that? Okay. I don't want to go into much of the technical details on this thing, except to say that these things are associated, on the one hand, with absolutely critical access to hard currency for a number of small developing states. You can find countries where huge percentages of their GNP come from access agreements. You can find other countries where basically the entire budget for managing their fisheries resources comes from what they get from access agreements. These things are critically important to the welfare of a number of developing countries. On the other hand, they are associated with depletion in a kind of slash and burn pattern that happened especially through the 80s and the 90s. And they are associated with very inequitable rent distributions, as Rashid was saying. These are often not technically parts of the apparatus of globalization governance. You don't see trade negotiations technically linked to access agreements. What you see instead is de facto linkages. So I can name particular examples where in the late 1980s, Europe went to a North African country and said, we want access to your EEZ fish. And that northern African country said, well, we really think you're taking too many of them. Our conservation principles tell us we should restrict your access to those fish. And they said, that's fine. Would you like to sell anything else to the European Union next year? Right? So there was a de facto link politically made between market access and access to fish. You won't see it in the formal documents, but it's a reality of international trade negotiations. Okay. Limiting trade and tariffs. How am I doing on time, Mr. Moderator? What am I I didn't look what time I started, but
I think probably 10 minutes.
That's fine. That's perfect. I'm only going to say 2 words on tariffs and quotas because I think Karen is probably going to go into this more. I guess my question is it a major issue? Is it a major issue? And I'll just put out the sort of WWF line on this for a moment, which I personally share, which is that globalization is a major issue, and trade flows are a major issue, and the question whether developing countries should have export-oriented fisheries is a major issue. But what actually happens to tariffs and quotas in general is not a major issue. It is not a major issue because because the quotas are pretty much all gone, with some exceptions. There are important exceptions. And for tariffs, first of all, they're mainly gone. They're very low. And to the extent that you've got price signals that are really shaping things now, those price signals are being driven by supply and demand much more than they are being driven by tariffs. And that on a global basis, changes in tariff levels are not substantially going to alter total supply, total demand, or even really the distribution of supply and demand. But on individual basis, on a particular fisheries basis, there may be specific fisheries where the product is possibly going to be severely changed by a drop in a tariff. And it is possible on a fisheries by fisheries basis to identify particular fisheries where if somebody drops a tariff, who gets to fish it or how much fish is going to get fished will really change. And depletion could result. What that means is that we need to carefully assess the impacts of tariff changes on fisheries in order to identify the sensitive fisheries where tariff changes would be important, and to do something about it before you let the tariff drop. SIAs, or Sustainability Impact Assessments, and I won't go into those. Okay, public investment in fisheries and fisheries subsidies. A couple things that I'd like to say about this. First, Rashid has told us subsidies are a big deal. There are billions and billions out there. They are often associated with maintaining or increasing fishing effort or fishing capacity where that's not a good idea. What's happening now is that in the context of the Doha round of trade negotiations that has been going on since 2001, the WTO is considering new rules on fisheries subsidies. And I won't go through the arduous history of those negotiations except to say that in 2001, when the round was launched, trade negotiators were told, go out and think about whether you want to do something about fisheries subsidies, but there was no clear direction to the mandate. But in 2005, when trade ministers met in Hong Kong to decide what the negotiating mandate for the last phase of the negotiations should be, a very important step forward was taken. And today, the negotiating mandate for the WTO is to agree on a prohibition, a ban. Trade ministers have agreed in principle to adopt a new international ban on fisheries subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. Now, this was big news, and in fact, in one of the most, a professional peak moment for me, I woke up one morning, and this was actually the front page lead story in the International Herald Tribune. I mean, a wonk's delight, fisheries subsidies on the lead article. Because there was this international agreement to agree, we're going to ban the bad boys. We're going to ban the bad fisheries subsidies. But, of course, an agreement to agree is only an agreement to agree. And there are big questions going on now, assuming the round goes to completion, which is, of course, a big issue. And the three major questions that are facing negotiators in Geneva now are they going to negotiate a ban, or are they going to negotiate a sieve? When I'm in Switzerland, I say, is it going to be Swiss cheese, right? What's really going to be included in this ban and what's not? So the EC right now is arguing, well, we would like only things that increase capacity to be included. We don't want to talk about subsidies to effort, right? So if you build a fishing boat, that would be increasing capacity. But if you outfit a fishing boat or pay for its fuel, that wouldn't be within the ban according to the EC. That's effort, not capacity. They want only capacity. And by the way, capacity means only things which actually increase capacity. And according to the EC, if they buy a whole set of new engines for their North Sea trawler fleet, and those new engines are fuel efficient, that will be an environmentally beneficial subsidy because that's good for climate change. Fuel efficiency is good for climate change. And they promise to put in engines that aren't any stronger than the engines that are already in the boats. So the engines won't get more powerful, just more fuel efficient. So you see, that's not an increase in capacity. So that would be allowed under the ban also. Okay? So where we're going to really wind up with this ban is subject to this kind of nonsense. Second, some big categories of fisheries are going to fall outside the ban. That's going to include primarily subsidies that are used by developing countries. The basic idea that developed countries should get out of the business of subsidizing capacity and effort cannot, in political terms, really be applied to developing countries, many of whom have underdeveloped fisheries, as they view them, underdeveloped fishing industries, and maybe not fisheries, but underdeveloped industries that they wish to be able to grow as their northern trade partners did through subsidies. So there is going to be some kind of carve-out for developing countries. There will also be carve-outs for other elements like infrastructure, building ports, or marketing. Those are not going to come within the ban for developed countries as well. So there are going to be a lot of subsidies that escape even the best ban. The good news is that, at least in rhetoric, all of the people at the table, all the countries at the table have accepted that there should not be carte blanche for these exempted subsidies. And more than that, they have accepted that the conditions that should be put on them are environmental conditions. Now, this is a stunning development for people who have been involved in the trade and environment business since the NAFTA debate in the early 1990s. We now have a basic agreement that there should be environmental conditionality on certain kind of subsidies in the WTO. And what's more, that environmental conditionality has been proposed and promoted mainly by developing countries. In terms of the politics of globalization and environment, this is a remarkable thing. how that's going to work is not known, and it brings up something that maybe Karen will address also, and that is this thing. That is the thin green line. And the thin green line is the line that separates the WTO being a good guy on environment from the WTO being Godzilla and stomping all over the environment. Nobody wants the WTO to become a fisheries policy body, right? And the thin green line, I always say there are two perspectives on the thin green line. One is that people like me, and there I am, right, get up there and say, we want the WTO to be serious about environment, but we don't want them to become an environmental policymaker. Don't let it happen. Keep your hands off my environmental policies. The real political problem, though, if you're trying to get something done at the WTO, because they don't really care that much about whether they stomp on the environmental policies, is that guys like this say, don't mess with my trade policies. And right now, the big fight that's taking place in the WTO over the scope of the ban and over what kind of conditions will be put on subsidies is, can we get the WTO to adopt meaningful environmental conditionality? And the main problem in doing it is finding a way that keeps that keeps trade negotiators satisfied that we are not bringing environment too much into the WTO. So as much as environmentalists worry about the first, from my personal perspective, the real environmental progress that we have to make at the WTO depends more on overcoming the second worry than the first. Okay. The third major element of the WTO negotiations is going to be how much transparency do we get? And one of the things I'll say again at the end of my presentation is, I think that this is actually one of the critical questions for globalization and fisheries generally, not just in the fishing subsidies. But if you ask me, what are several of the things that you have to do most to make globalization work better for fish? It is increase the information flow about what is really happening. Increase the information flow about the fish and increase the information flow about the subsidies. And one of the things we're fighting for very hard is at the WTO is for rules that will take subsidies out of the hidden closets where they are and force countries really to tell each other what they're subsidizing, including in access agreements, by the way. So, okay, now I will go very quickly, Mr. Moderator, through the three things that I'm not going to cover in any detail. There are also a bunch of laws protecting consumers from rotten fish, basically. And if you go and you talk to people who are in the business of fish trade, they will tell you that these are the most important rules affecting the flow of trade out there. These are the day-to-day real barriers to what flows across borders. And in fact, they are often used as protectionist instruments, right? And in fact, if you look at the question, who gets the rents, who gets to sell, developing countries that are trying to get into the business of hard currency earning through fish trade, this is a major headache for them. How can they qualify? Now, from what's happening is, overall, an effort to harmonize the rules, the trade rules that apply to protecting consumers. And if not harmonize, at least get mutual recognition, where if we don't have the same rules, at least I recognize your rules. These are critically important for developing countries because they want to be able to sell. And they're critically important for environmentalists and for consumer protection advocates because they are the opportunity to erode rules. Harmonization can equal erosion. And so this is a major technical fight that at least has a big impact on who gets to sell. I'm not going to go into it any further. Trade measures for environmental purposes. IUU, illegal and unreported fishing. Tuna dolphin. Do countries have the right, do they sometimes have the obligation, to prevent imports of fish products that are hurting the environment or are caught illegally? The question under WTO rules, whether import bans of this kind are legal, is still unanswered. There is supposed to be a major negotiation going on inside the Doha round to try to answer that question. It's called the MEA, or Multilateral Environmental Agreement, part of the Doha round. And we are not going to see any significant result from that. And the question whether you can prevent a country, if the United States wants to prevent illegally caught fish from coming into its borders, the question whether that's okay under WTO law is going to remain unanswered. And there is going to remain at least some threat that countries are going to oppose trade measures for environmental purposes under WTO law. But I happen to think that the odds of that really happening are declining because the use of trade measures to stop bad fish from crossing borders is rapidly increasing. It's increasing because of the problem of IUU fishing, and you'll see, I think, even in the most recent Magnuson-Stevenson reauthorization, there is new language making it even harder to bring illegally caught fish into the United States. And international organizations, regional fisheries management organizations that are out there trying to get countries to cooperate and fish legally, are increasingly encouraging people to ban the import of illegally caught fish. So this is a growing fact of life, but it is still a policy coherence issue. And finally, I think I'll turn this off now, actually, because that's the end. Finally, eco-labeling. Eco-labeling is clearly emerging as an important issue. The market share that eco-labeled fish is gaining is growing rapidly. Some of you will have heard of the Marine Stewardship Council. That is probably the foremost eco-labeler of fish. Now we have Walmart saying that in the next several years it's going to source all of its fish. And by the way, yes, Walmart is a major consumer of fish. You have major European companies also promising to source their fish through eco-labeled fish. And so eco-labeling as a market phenomenon is growing. We have to wait and see whether it grows as a regulatory phenomenon. In other areas, such as, let's say, organic food labeling, what we saw was that once market share got to be really significant in eco-labeled products, the regulators came in and started really saying what could be eco-labeled, what couldn't be eco-labeled, what eco-labels mean, what shouldn't they mean. That hasn't happened yet on fish, but there are trends that way. And I would predict that in the next bunch of years, we're going to see national regulation in the area of eco-labeling of fish, and that this will obviously have an impact on what gets defined as sustainable and what doesn't get defined as sustainable. And from a developing country point of view, will have a big impact on how difficult or easy it may be for developing countries to gain access to eco-labels and to sell their products. So I will stop there. That's sort of the entire semester in 25 minutes, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having us here today, and thank you to the Wilson Center. I am going to speak much more, I'm not a trade policy expert. I work with an organization which is much more oriented at making change on the water. And we have just gone through almost 15 months where one of our vessels, the Esperanza, has been focused on traveling the waters of the world and exposing the issues that are affecting those. So all the way from the Southern Ocean up through the Atlantic to West Africa and looking at the fisheries of Guinea, through the Mediterranean and the impacts of tuna farming in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, coastal pollution and its impacts, all the way across through India and the Philippines, across the Pacific, looking at IUU fishing, the impacts of marine pollution, and then back down at the moment to the Southern Ocean, where we are busy watching the Japanese whaling fleet, which is disabled and doing all kinds of very strange things down there, which I could give a talk on if anyone wants to hear afterwards. In doing that, though, we have looked at the global problems embodied by a whole lot of these issues, and recently released a report called Trading Away Our Oceans, which focuses largely on how the impacts of globalization and international trade are working to deplete our oceans, and how the discussions at the WTO, particularly on non-agricultural market access issues, could have a very severe impact on the issues that have already been raised by David and Rashid, overfishing, overcapacity, subsidies. And in fact, this would be one of those issues where perhaps doing nothing may be the best approach that the WTO could take, not getting involved in liberalizing the fisheries trade until there are adequate measures in place, both from the exporting countries and importing countries, could be the sanest move that the international community could take to make sure that there are fish for the future. So just to summarize very quickly, a lot of this has already been said. Looking at import value and the main markets, the key markets is from the maps that Rashid showed us, being the European Union, the US and Japan, developing countries making up only some 12% of the market for fish products, and yet coastal communities with over 1 billion people dependent on fish protein as their primary source of protein around the world. The main species being exported by value. Again, this has been dealt with, but I deal better with pie graphs than the pictures work better for me. And looking at shrimp being a major factor in world trade and being one of the most destructive fisheries that's out there. And in fact, as I was preparing for this, the most interesting factoid I came across was that the US Gulf shrimp trawl fishery is the most destructive shrimp fishery on the planet in terms of the amount of bycatch and the impact on the environment that it has had so far. So looking as well at salmon, tuna, and then the groundfish fisheries, and bearing in mind the recent study that came out from Borris Worm and his colleagues, detailing that by 2048, most fisheries, commercial fisheries, could no longer be in existence if we continue at the same rate. Again, very briefly, trade flows, high-value products going north, low-value species going south. If you look at tariffs, and David raised this issue, we think that declines in tariffs at this point could actually be very significant in their impact on already substantial overfishing. They may be low when you look at them in the scheme of things, but getting rid of tariffs can have substantial impacts. And I'm going to look at, in our study, we look at 4 very different examples. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, Mauritania, Argentina, and Senegal, to look at how access to various markets and reductions in tariffs have actually had a huge impact on those economies and their fisheries. So what happens when you cut tariffs on fish? And I should say that the pictures are drawn from some of the work we did in West Africa. Some of them are included in the slides. I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail at the end of this talk, because I think it really paints the human face of what's happening out there. The theory is if you cut tariffs, you change the price. Consumers pay less and producers get paid more. That price change also stimulates supply. But in fisheries, you've got a fundamental factor working, which is that you only have a certain amount of fish in the sea. We should tell our mothers that. And what happens is that there's ineffective management can lead to overfishing and depletion. And so fish liberalization can only bring about sustainable benefits if there is effective fisheries management from both the exporting and the importing end of things. Fundamental question as well when we're looking at this issue. How much room is there to increase wild fish production? Well, if we look at the state of the world's stocks, and you add some of these colors together, around 77% of our commercial fisheries fit into the depleted, overexploited, fully exploited, or recovering blocks. And that leaves around 23% in the moderately exploited and underexploited areas. And when you look at the long-term trends in that, we have the number of underexploited or moderately exploited fisheries heading down, So more fisheries are fully exploited and overexploited, and that's a real problem. And that's where we get to these examples of, I see we have the strange spelling for Mauritania, and look at duty-free access to EU markets for fisheries exports. Basically, what's happened in Mauritania, and these studies were UNEP studies that were done as part of a process towards feeding information into the WTO discussions. We have in Mauritania what we call impoverishing growth, an incredibly poor country exporting huge amounts of fish to the European market. The result has been essentially shark and ray stocks are almost extinct in these waters, which are in the past have been some of the richest waters. And I think Rashid used the example of Guinea, showing the distinction between 1960 and now. This is just up the garden path from there. Previously plentiful species have basically disappeared, and discards, bycatch from these fisheries are so large that they are themselves causing environmental degradation in those waters as a result of increase in acids, in all kinds of effluents into those waters, and a reduction in oxygen in those waters. And for the coastal communities dependent on fisheries, food security has been compromised. We have the government of Mauritania under pressure from international financial institutions to sell off their fisheries products to meet the need for foreign exchange. So I think, as David mentioned, the impact being, yes, the country may be earning foreign exchange, but their food security is compromised, their environment is compromised, their future ability to feed their population and is compromised, and it's just a lose-lose situation. Then we go to Argentina, a very, very different economy, where essentially export-oriented growth was encouraged in order to address a fiscal crisis there. And the EU went in and suggested that joint ventures were absolutely key to developing the Argentine fisheries sector. What are joint ventures? A European company sets up shop in Argentina, they own the boats, they have an Argentine chair of the board, and it all looks Argentinian, but it's not. Weak fisheries management, incredibly weak fisheries management, has resulted in severe overfishing, so that by 2002, 6 major Argentine stocks are endangered, and that includes things like hake, blue whiting, what you call here Chilean sea bass. In Senegal, this is an example of a country where there is a lot of export to Europe, but also there is a very strong domestic economy for fish and for fish consumption. And basically, we have the same result. Catches falling for all species, but especially for export species, some which are threatened now with extinction. Fish being caught before they reach sexual maturity. We've got dragging or bottom trawling, destroying and changing the habitat in such a way in the offshore fishery that it's basically compromising biodiversity and ecological replacement. And the quality and quantity of domestic supply is diminished. In Senegal, we also have the situation where the artisanal fishing sector is now selling their catch to the offshore fleet in order to earn more money than they can from selling the fish at the market. So the people, again, who are losing are the poor coastal communities. And now the artisanal fleet has bought into the whole system and is helping to undermine the fishery and the economy and its future. These are not exceptions. 3 very different countries, very different examples. Again, this is not Greenpeace data, this is UNEP data based on FAO data. And the result is, the conclusions are, developing countries simply cannot afford to continue along this path without effective fisheries management. They're being squeezed to increase exports and preyed upon by fishing nations. if the NAMA negotiations go forward at the WTO, the countries that will benefit will be a very few countries in the long term that have a very developed fishery sector, but also very developed rules for their fisheries. Canada, Norway, Iceland, and New Zealand are examples of that. There will be short-term gains for countries like Thailand, where as the African countries lose their access advantage to the European Union for tuna, for example, Thailand becomes the major hub for the canning and selling of tuna that goes to Europe. And basically everybody else loses out. So, in typical Greenpeace fashion, we think we have quite a simple solution. We think the WTO should abandon fisheries liberalization at this point. And we stress that fishing countries have got to adhere to international conservation instruments. They have to start taking responsibility for their actions. David spoke about the rights and responsibilities under UNCLOS. And, you know, over the past 3 years, my focus has been on negotiations at the United Nations. There is absolutely no question that the focus in those negotiations are on short-term rights rather than long-term responsibilities. And our oceans just don't have the time anymore to continue along that path. So just going back as part of the discussion that we've had today, I think between Rashid and David, they came up with a series of solutions, and I'm going to use some of these pictures to try and draw some of those solutions out. These pictures are all from Guinea. Improving fisheries management institutions and monitoring, control, and surveillance. And the US has actually played a key role in getting together a voluntary network of monitoring, control, and surveillance agencies so that they can start to pool their resources. We strongly believe that we wouldn't have voluntary associations for surveillance of terrorist activities around the world. Illegal fishing and its impacts on the future of world communities is probably going to be more serious in the long term for food security and poverty alleviation than many other factors. And so we would propose that there be what we simply call an Interpol for the oceans, a central agency that centralizes those monitoring, control, and surveillance activities, a one-stop shop where if you have a vessel fishing in your waters, you can go online, you can look it up, you can find out its history, who owns it, whether it's allowed to fish. If it's not allowed to fish and it's not allowed to be there, it has a series of infractions against it, you can go ahead and arrest it. Another thing that has to be dealt with is the genuine link, flag of convenience vessels. And this is where I have to say that the US is not pulling its weight in terms of addressing this issue, partly because a lot of the US commercial fleet is flagged mostly to countries like Panama. And so if we could get countries to look at defining the genuine link for fishing vessels, if that makes it easier, that would be a core instrument in addressing some of these issues. This is, again, a picture, and you see the bags of fish, the sanitary fish that go to Europe, and then the fish in the boxes that go to Africa. And again, you know, the key here is they're lying right next to one another. Just because the one's in a bag and the other isn't, doesn't make it any better to eat the fish. And here is another example of sorting of the fish on the deck of a vessel. Most of these vessels that we saw, and there were hundreds of them, were flagged to China or Korea. And later on in the scheme of things, there's a transshipment. These vessels live in these waters. They don't go anywhere. They're rusting hulks. We called them a vessel graveyard, essentially. The people who staff them are there for 3 to 6 months at a time. They run out of food, and then they get resupplied. And their job is to fish. And they catch the fish, and they keep them in the hold, and they transship them, and the fish goes straight to ports like Las Palmas and straight into the Spanish market, evading all the rules, as David outlined earlier. And that's where fair fisheries agreements come into the scheme of things. And it's absolutely essential that we begin to work on how we can have, again, leveling the playing field, fair fisheries agreements, that it doesn't matter where you're fishing, if it's in the waters of a developing country, the same rules apply. This is just an example of, this is what one of these vessels look like, and these people live on them. They are hardly seaworthy by any stretch of the imagination. They can't go anywhere. They can't go anywhere in their own steam. And that deals with the issue of overcapacity. So where are these old boats going? They're going to these waters, and they're sitting there. Often they are strung out just along the line of the exclusive economic zone, evading the domestic law rules and regulations that are in place. Often there's no fisheries enforcement, so they don't really have to care what they do. They can go, they can be strung out anywhere. There are no vessels to enforce the rules. And there's a great example of where Japan sold off a whole lot of its fishing fleet to diminish overcapacity to Taiwan, and then brought into the fleet fewer, much newer vessels, which had the capacity to travel further, fish deeper, do everything more than the boats had before, and meanwhile the other boats are fishing for Taiwan. Swap flags, move them out, the fleet just gets bigger. 24,000 large fishing vessels, I think, have been registered and are fishing the high seas and everywhere else, and have been, and that number is not diminishing. And this is the opposite, the little canoes that the local fishers are fishing in, the impacts on their lives. When you have a trawler fishing behind you, it's quite difficult to catch fish. The stories from these fishers of having to travel further out to catch fish because a lot of the fishing vessels are illegal, they don't have lights on, they can just, there's stories of deaths and fatalities from these canoes being mowed down in these waters. And basically, it's not just about the fish and the environment, it's about the people. And basically, indentured servitude. These workers from Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, stuck on these vessels for months on end. And here is the rusting hulk next to the transshipment vessel that comes and takes the fish off to market. So another key aspect in all of this is we can't just address this from the trade angle. We can't just deal with subsidies. We have to look at the whole picture. We have to look at how fisheries are being managed globally. And one of the issues that Rashid raised was the issue of marine protected areas. For Greenpeace, setting up a global network of marine reserves is going to be the only way that we manage to secure fish as food and the marine environment for the future. Under the World Summit on Sustainable Development, countries are supposed to set up this global network by 2012. At the moment, I think there's less than 1% of the world's oceans have been declared marine protected areas. And there's a distinction. When we talk about marine reserves, we talk about no-take areas. A lot of marine protected areas are that in name, but basically enable fishers to go in and restrict a certain only one activity. So we believe it is absolutely crucial at this point. There is very little time to lose, and that countries, and the US could be absolutely key in this process. And part of that for the US requires becoming a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, and engaging as a full partner in those negotiations, and looking at the key role that protected areas could play across the world's oceans. We are proposing a global network of 40% of the oceans. Some people think that's pretty extreme. We think it's more extreme not to have any fish in our oceans by 2048. Unfortunately, we're at a time where radical measures are necessary, and that the combination of protected areas where fish and biodiversity is free to develop and grow, coupled with enforcement mechanisms that are effective from ship all the way to shelf, is going to be crucial, as I say, if we're going to have fish for the future. So with that, I think I've got two little points from David's, just to add into that. The transparency in all of that is absolutely essential as well, not only with trade negotiations, but in understanding why countries are going after some of those fish. We need to know how much bycatch they're catching. We need independent observers on board. We need to know where they are catching those fish. One of the issues some of us have recently worked on is the issue of high seas bottom trawling. Nobody knows where this fishing method is taking place. And until there is a good reservoir of information, the system essentially allows for the rich biodiverse areas to be fished out in a sequential manner. And because nobody knows who's been there before, you can argue that you can go and do it. And finally, in terms of eco-labeling issues, this is one of the issues where, and trade measures, these are two of the issues where we think there could be a lot of room for management that could be crucial to the future of fisheries. Unfortunately, the current systems of eco-labeling are insufficient. The MSC, for example, and those of you who shop at Whole Foods will see that you can now buy MSC certified Chilean sea bass. The MSC has certified a section of the Chilean sea bass fishery which is very well controlled. In an entire ocean of a fishery which is incredibly unsustainable and where up to 80% of the fish are illegally caught. That is highly problematic. They are certifying incredibly destructive fisheries like the northern prawn fishery, which is a bottom trawl fishery. So it may be well managed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's sustainable, and we need to work through those things as we look towards eco-labeling. And trade measures are actually some of those key measures, and I think that's somewhere where we can push the envelope. Again, Chilean sea bass, the US role in monitoring the trade certification scheme for Chilean sea bass has been absolutely crucial for that fishery. Unfortunately, it is a system which for developing countries is very, very difficult. But for importing states, the US, Japan, and Europe, it's going to be crucial as part of the program and part of the issues we need in order to make sure that fisheries work in the future. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Well, Rashid, David, and Karen, thank you very, very much. You've given us an awful lot to work with and knowledge to digest. We'll turn to a Q&A now. I ask that you identify yourself and tell us where you're coming from, and use the microphone so our folks on the web can hear your question as well. So Ken, why don't we start over here and then come to the gentleman over there.
My name is Augustus Vogel, and I work at the Oceanographer of the Navy. And my question stems from, these are very economic issues, and for a class a number of years back, and I'm not going to necessarily defend these numbers, but I looked at the subsidies that the U.S. puts into terrestrial agriculture versus the subsidies that the U.S. puts into fisheries, and something 2 or 3 orders of magnitude difference. I mean, and my point is, though, is that there's a very serious demand for protein that's out there. And there was also an article in Science in, I think, 2004, Bashir, I think, connecting fishery resource availability and bushmeat hunting. And so the point is that there's a demand for protein, and we can regulate these fisheries, and we can have perfect laws, and everybody can obey the law. But at some point, we've either already passed or we're about to pass the amount of protein that we can get out of natural ecosystems in the ocean. So my question is that none of you really brought up the issue of aquaculture, yet that seems to be I know there's a lot of negative things to say about aquaculture, and certainly not many aquaculture operations on the Monterey Bay Fish Watch list or whatever that is have been described as good. But the point is that there seems to me, in my mind, a very important need for that type of fishery productivity. And I was just curious some of your opinions about where that should go, because that seems something that's going to be even more powerful than looking at some of these countries' regulations.
Can I say, since we have limited time, why don't we take 2 or 3 questions and then give you guys a chance? So, gentlemen here, please. Right behind you, there's a microphone.
My name is Matteo Malazzo. I'm with the U.S. government, NMFS Commerce. Briefly, I was impressed by these presentations. You all, in different ways, agreed that the existing system suppresses trade. When you talked about tariffs and quotas and subsidies and the rules of trade and the access agreements, but you had different views on trade. At the risk of oversimplifying, the first 2 seemed to think that globalization and increased trade is a good thing. The third presenter seemed to suggest that it's not so great. And from my perspective, I am far more persuaded that increased trade and globalization is inevitable and on balance a good thing, and it's hopeless to resist it, and we ought to support improved disciplines and trade liberalizations in the WTO trade route. It is only through increased trade that the developing countries will have the incentives and the resources to do the kinds of things that Karen explained needs to be done. So I think that from my point of view, the globalization debate proceeded here this afternoon, and I think we need to embrace it intelligently and prudently and with reform rather than seek to resist it.
Others, I'm having a hard time. The light's not so good. Okay, go ahead, please. Yep.
Sorry. I'm Ted McDorman from nowhere. I'm here at the center.
We like to think of this.
I'm also from
somewhere.
Victoria. You should invite me over sometime. Over to UBC at the fisheries thing. And a couple of points. Most of them, they're not challenges, David. They're questions. The first one, I just want to emphasize a point that you made to do with safety standards for fishing and environmental standards. One of the repercussions of that, and what I'm talking about is seafood safety standards, something I actually know something about, and the trade, because of that, has largely been changed. And I've watched it, not so much in Africa where I have no experience, but in the South Pacific. Basically, all the small-time fishermen just don't have a market because they can't meet the standards of the European community. And they can't meet the standards of the United States and Canada, and they can't meet the standards of Japan. The only people who can meet those standards are corporations who've got to, take the fish so they'll be able to do the veterinary standards that are required. This is also the same in many of the environmental things that are put in place by the United States and others, whether it be catch requirements or whatever. It's had the interesting effect of corporatizing the international fisheries. Now, this has a positive and a negative. The positive is you're getting safer fish, and you're getting a better sense that it comes from better sources, and there's possibility of it being from sources that are sustainable. The negative part is most of the speakers, made emphasis of the small-time fishermen, and I would go beyond the artisanal, but just for the small-time corporate fishermen as well. They're basically being wiped out by the very standards that we all applaud. So it's an interesting. As a person, as a professor, I love paradox, and I love pointing out, and when someone says something, I'll immediately take the other side. So that's a comment. And then you did refer to that. What I would not so much challenge, but just sort of inquire is whether you don't think the WTO actually has a bit more of a role to play in the fisheries issues. I think, based on my own experience, we're about 5 to 10 years away from the WTO, or I hope and think the WTO stepping in and saying that you must be able to show, to market your fish, you must be able to show it comes from a sustainable resource. It must come from a sustainable stock. That would be a development of the regional fisheries management organizations and their catch requirements and all that sort of stuff. And the only body that can do that at the international level would strike me as being the WTO. It's not going to be FAO. It's not going to be any of the other organizations. And that would be a positive step, given that it would only affect essentially 3 markets, Japan, the European Union, and the United States. if they agreed to that kind of a measure, which there's good reason to think they would in the fullness of time, that you could actually put that in place internationally. And you will have to have, in my opinion, as a lawyer, you would have to have that in place at an international level, not through the RFMOs themselves, because you've got the problem of the people who are not parties to the RFMO. And my last and final thing as a lawyer is be careful how you use the word illegal. A lot of the fishing you're talking about is not illegal. It's unregulated, heaven knows, and it's unreported, but it is not necessarily illegal. And that just is, you know, as a cautionary, you basically, for some of you anyways, one or two of the speakers, the lawyers just immediately tune out, because all they're doing is thinking, oh my God, the guy doesn't know what he's talking about, because all he's done is kind of got everything together as illegal. And you do have to be careful, and this plays out in terms of how the negotiations and how the discussions goes, because some countries are very reluctant, because they don't think it's illegal. They think they can proceed. That's how they look at their rights. And while a lot of the discussions have been, very interesting, you do have to take the account that the countries themselves make those kinds of distinctions in discussions.
Okay, terrific, thank you. Why don't we give the panelists a chance to respond?
Yeah. I'm wondering if I should take the first question and I leave the second and third to the two of you, right? This thing about aquaculture and fish consumption. You are very right. There's demand, an increasing demand for fish and fish protein. That's part of the reason, or if not the main reason, why we have these pressures. So my solution to you, reduce demand. How will you do this? One is to reduce consumption per capita, and the other thing is to reduce the per capita, the people, So this is one solution, if you really want to deal with this, which may be difficult. So then you have aquaculture coming into play. I think it has some role to play, but you also have to watch out. A lot of the aqua production is based on producing fish that also eats fish. So you have this situation where you take fish, anchovies, feed them into salmon. Sometimes, according to the ecologists, you get less than the number of kilos you actually feed to them. So that's one type of agriculture which I think will not help the demand problem. The other one is when you have things like carps and tilapia that invertebrates eat plants and so on. Yeah, there's possibility that increase in production of those can help meet some of the demand. Okay.
I won't say more about aquaculture. I think that sounds basically right to me, other than that regulating aquaculture is a huge issue. And yes, we're going to wind up depending on protein from aquaculture, so we better regulate it right, I guess is the answer. But I want to start with Matteo, who has made a lot of contributions as an individual to the fisheries subsidies debate that have been really great. But I'm going to disagree with the two things that he said right off the bat, which is about how the world works and about what I said. First, I don't agree that the current system suppresses trade. I think it fails to regulate trade. I think that, in fact, by the fact that it defines out of being even part of trade some huge chunk of the actual cross-border flow of fish doesn't mean it suppresses that trade. It means it doesn't pay attention to it. And I also think that the steady rise in the percentage of fish that enter international trade, which you see on all the charts, which once again does not include a whole bunch of fish that cross borders otherwise, sort of demonstrates that our problem isn't that we're suppressing trade. On the contrary, I tend to agree with Karen that trade-oriented fisheries policies have been so under-examined in terms of their social and their environmental consequences that we are in fact rushing ahead with trade much more than we are suppressing it as a system. And that comes to the second thing, which is do I think that more trade is necessarily good, or is further liberalization good? And there again, I would agree with the fundamental point that globalization is a fact of life, that trade is going to continue to be absolutely critical part of things, and that simply opposing globalization and opposing trade is, that's a non-position. So I agree with that. I even agree with what I said before, oddly enough, that that on a global basis, tariff reduction isn't our biggest problem. But I actually kind of agree with Greenpeace that if we're going to do such a bad job managing everything, and if we're not asking the kind of intelligent policy coherence questions which need to be asked, then we really would be better off not liberalizing than going ahead. Even though I don't happen to think that tariff reductions is, that's not where I would draw the line to fight the big fight. I agree with the fundamental conclusion that what we need is smarter trade and more coherent trade. But I don't agree either that the current system suppresses it or that necessarily encouraging liberalization is the way forward. I think managing liberalization is the way forward. Ted's remarks I thought were really good. I think that it's really true that the SPS, the standard, the health standards, and the things you need to do to make trade work to the satisfaction of northern customers is having a huge impact on who gets to fish, and precisely the little folks are getting pushed out. And I think that if you could sort of reach Shangri-La, maybe we would really be going back to encouraging much more local consumption for food security purposes than all this trade. But that's not going to happen entirely, and the questions of these standardizations is going to really remain. I think it's probably not true that in the next bunch of years the WTO is going to demand everybody to have sustainable fish as a right to import. One of the things that you have to look at that's really remarkable about these fisheries subsidies negotiations that are taking place is the starting position of the WTO legal system, politically and legally, is that distinguishing between a product that is sustainably harvested and a product that is not sustainably harvested is illegal, right? That you're not allowed as a trade system to distinguish between, to take it back to the origins, tuna fish that was caught killing dolphins and tuna fish that wasn't caught killing dolphins, because there's no tuna there's no dolphin in the can. It's the same product. Blah blah blah. So fundamentally, the trade system's starting place is that such distinctions are trade illegal. Now, I think that is unstable, and that is going to change at the WTO. And I actually believe that if we succeed at these fishery subsidies negotiations, what we're doing will make a significant contribution to beginning to get the WTO at least to get out of the way. I don't think we're going to see, and you can imagine down the road a time when national governments, for example, put much higher tariffs on unsustainable fish than on sustainable fish. Today, that would be WTO illegal, right? I think that where we may be moving with the WTO system is allowing national governments to do more to control the flows of trade. But for the WTO actually to take the lead, I just don't think is going to happen. I take the point on the vocabulary of illegal versus unregulated. It's absolutely right. It helps us advocates in the trenches to call it all illegal because that gets people upset. So we're probably going to keep doing that. But it's true.
I don't have a whole lot to add because I think that was all very well said. I do have to say that I use the word unregulated a lot because there's far more unregulated and unreported fishing than there is illegal fishing. And that's, again, goes to the core of those management issues, both from the import and the export side. I do have to expose a little bit of the idealist in me. I'm from, in case you didn't think I was one to begin with, I am from South Africa, which has a long and torrid history of foreign fleets coming into its waters and fishing out a lot of the fish. A number of years ago, the South Africans were negotiating a trade agreement with the EU, which was making certain demands. And South Africa was a strong enough country at that point to say, sorry, we don't agree with the terms, and you can close off your other markets to us. We have enough to export. We will not accept the terms of your agreement. Now, most countries can't do that, and that gets back to the issue of fair fisheries agreements. And I'm talking kind of to the paradox that was raised about environmental standards and health and safety standards, because I think if there was a way to include in those fair fisheries agreements training and education and monitoring and control and surveillance elements and as part of that as well, the training elements went into working with local fishers to help them develop and comply with some of those standards that could really work. It has, in some circumstances in Brazil, where co-management of fisheries has been very successful. And I know, again, using South Africa as an example, there are, in some of the quota allocations, a certain amount of the quota is allocated to the large fishing companies for export, and a certain amount allocated to companies for either domestic consumption or for export. But the companies, actually the small companies and the larger companies, have to work together in order to meet those same standards. This is not the panacea, and it's not the thing that's going to change the world. But I do think that, as Rashid raised, there are ways of bringing into some of those agreements methods that can work to build up those smaller fishers and help them to meet those standards. And I have to say, from our experience in Guinea and in the Philippines as well over the past year, the fish that are being exported to Europe, and the example was the picture of the fish in bags versus the fish on the deck. The fish in the bags had been scraped off the deck into the bags, and they were just complying with those safety standards. It was the same fish, it had come from the same place, it had been lying in the sun for the same amount of time, and yet the one was being reported as meeting those sanitary standards and the other wasn't. So go figure on that one.
Yeah, just a little point, Ted, on your illegal thing, is like they said, it's a good point you raised. When taking you back to my graph, the one the picture I put up on apprehended illegal fishers. I call them illegal there because they've been apprehended by nations. So the assumption is that they are fishing within EEZs and therefore doing something illegal. But clearly, yeah, it's good to know those differences. Yeah.
Dan Scalero from the Global Environment Facilities International Waters Learn Project. I came here today, I guess, with a professional and a personal questions, both of which I was looking to have answered. On the professional side, IW Learn's been working with large marine ecosystems as units of management, and in fact, working with our colleagues at NOAA and elsewhere, we've developed some marine LME governance handbooks and actually looking into economic valuation as a future workshop for a number of the LMEs around the world. Certainly there's some examples like the Southwest Pacific Ocean, the Caspian Sea, Tanzania's marine and coastal environmental management project, and even Benguela Current off in South Africa, where we're seeing these regional governance systems set up in such a way that we may have a little bit more regional control over these issues as they're brought to bear from the G7, G8, and plus China. What I'm wondering is from a professional perspective, what are we missing in terms of the knowledge capacity gaps? Is it really a learning issue in developing countries, or is it more of a governance issue that's we know what to do, but it's just a question of doing it? And for the latter, we're actually looking forward to doing a future DC marine community activity focusing on that topic in the next month or two. On a personal scale, it seems to me, or personal level, I've noticed how the fisheries trade, which I learned a little bit about what country import-export came from today from our colleague at WWF, but how it is that, how we can put in place incentives on governance on the developed countries side to support this whole problem of countries that are exporting fish are net exporters, and at the same time they're severely protein deficient among their own populations. And if I get one thing out of today, to know from a heart perspective that we're moving in a direction that could support protein sustainability among the countries that are exporting fish, I think we're one step closer to a sustainability, at least on the land side, if not in the direction of the ocean side. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Other? Yeah. It's a gentleman over here, and then a gentleman over here.
I'm Greg Pendleton from NOAA. We heard a little bit about illegal fishing in EEZs, and I'm wondering whether any of you could talk a bit about ITLOS and whether you see their prompt release proceedings as successes or failures in that respect.
Sir?
I'm Lidvar Granuet from the World Bank, working on the ProFish program, and I have just a few comments. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. It got many questions that could be raised. I will, in general, like Matteo said, have a general comment, but on the other side, I think that what I got out of what you said, all three of you, and that is in agreement with the World Bank perspective and the other work on fisheries, is that what is needed is better governance. The need for good governance and better governance, and that is the overarching theme that we are trying to focus on in the ProFish program in World Bank. So the few comments I have is basically focusing on the need for be more specific. For example, when we are now, you mentioned both Mauritania, Argentina, and Senegal. And Mauritania and Senegal, there's now, in Mauritania, it's about to start an active fisheries program for the World Bank. But then, what we have to deal with is the Mauritanian government, and you need to take into the equation the whole, the very important issue of national sovereignty and self-determination, decision for the different countries, and clearly there can be many things said, but when we are now dealing with Mauritania, there is a whole story, and we had a coup in August in 2005, and there is an election in a few weeks now. But the issue of what is these developing countries or the other countries, what they want themselves, this has to be taken into equation. And the EU, for the EU, the agreement with Mauritania is the most important one, and it's a price of, or a payment of about $100 million each year, and they just entered into a new agreement for a 6-year period in the middle of last year. And in the same line, just a comment, like you said, Japan is selling vessels to Taiwan. Of course, it is not Japan, it is the private operators, it's private owners of vessels in the private sector selling to, I suppose, private owners in Taiwan. And I think it needs to be taken into the equation or the way of looking at it. This is private sector decisions, and of course in the US and in Europe, and this is not question at all, the right to the private sector. And just coming from a visit to a West African country, what we really see a need for is exactly to develop a vibrant private sector. Then, of course, it's not my point to defend the EU, but I would say that if you're talking about the EU, then you need to distinguish between before 2002 and after 2002. Because there was a major revision of the common fisheries policy, and also how this is relating to the development policy of the EU in 2002. So I would say that the story in the 80s and 90s is not that relevant really anymore. And also I would point you to the direction that the EU is now having out a consulting paper on how to strengthen the work on IUU fishing. And there is a period that anyone can send comments up until the 12th of March this year. The last point I would say, that is not just a small point, but I think it might be important that you mentioned this article about 2048 and the fishing.
Yeah, that one.
And I would say that when I now hear from the people the expert on fish stocks around, they really think that is very flawed, the whole article. And I would also say that when we in the World Bank, as a very few people arguing in a big organization, why to be engaged in the fishery sector, it is not helpful. If all the fish are going out in 2048, one example of how wrong it is. The way they are defining the depleted stocks is that they are counting any stock that has ever been low. And coming from Norway, I have a very personal experience in how to rebuild the enormous herring stock there that was almost completely destroyed around 1970. And I was part of, when I worked in the government there, to regulate a total ban on the fishing in the 1980s. And then this is now rebuilt completely, and the annual quota this year is 1.3 million tons. And this is still in this article counted as destroyed stock. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Well, why don't we give our panelists a final opportunity? I'm sure there are more questions, but we've come to the end of our time. If the three of you would like to make some concluding remarks addressing these questions, that would be terrific.
Oh, there you go. You want to go? Do the first one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I can take your herring example straight away. I mean, that's an interesting story. But you were involved, and the reason, I guess, is because there was strong management after the stocks have come so low. So what would you think if there wasn't a ban, a well-monitored and controlled ban? Where will the stocks be now? Just hazard a guess. Maybe it will be gone. So I think essentially that's the point that came out of that paper. You do something or you don't, and this is likely to be there. I'm not defending the graph because I didn't draw it, but essentially the story is a good warning, I think. We need measures like the one you helped to put in place to save the herring. And in many parts of the world, this is not happening, right? You have stocks low and no good management. Okay, so which one again can I take? The large marine ecosystem question, I'm happy to tell you that I'm involved partly with that effort, with the Benguela system. I actually did a study for them to try to see the potential benefit of cooperative management, coming together to jointly manage the resources. That is Namibia, Angola, South Africa. And they've actually decided, agreed, I don't know whether they've implemented this already, to put up a Benguela Current Commission made up of these three countries, their management system, to try to manage the stocks well. So, but you had a very specific question related to whether the issue is that of learning more about the system, or is it just implementation? And that is a tough one. I mean, it will depend a lot from system to system. In the Benguela system, I would think that they know reasonably enough to be able to do something in that particular system about the fishery. So maybe action is where you want to put in more weight. But if you go to the Gulf of Guinea current, I think there's a lot to study there yet. There are 16 countries fishing in the same small Gulf of Guinea, and they don't even, some of the nations don't even realize that the neighbor is fishing the same stock, right? So there's a lot to learn about the stock. This will depend a lot on where you are. In terms of protein and export, this is a big problem which I worry about myself a lot. You have a situation where people seem to be malnourished, and then when they catch the fish, they ship it off for the money, right? And this is the problem you have with trade. And in these coastal areas in West Africa, I think the big issue is that most of the time the benefit of the trade doesn't trickle down, doesn't come down to the community. And this is what bothers me most. So they lose the fish, which they normally caught and fed themselves, and they don't have the dollars to buy, say, animal protein to feed it. This is an issue I think concerned citizens of the world will have to look at very closely so we find a solution to deal with that. I don't have no solution there. Maybe education will do it. I really care about the education thing I mentioned before. And in general, when it comes to education, I feel the whole global community really needs to take responsibility for educating every child in the world, actually. Because like my old dad used to tell me, with education, you never know whom it is going to benefit, right? Just help educate anyone, because you never know. It can be anything, right? So really, that is, I came back to education. Sorry for that, but I care so much about it. Now, illegal fishing, somebody asked whether there are examples of successes or failures. Is that your question? With illegal fishing?
I was asking about the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea and whether or not you think it's working at all, I guess.
Okay,
I
maybe
do
you can do that better. What I know is that South Africa was so frustrated with their own local courts, because when they catch an illegal fisher, you take to the courts and the judges will say, "What has the man done? It's just fishing. What's the problem?" Right? They let go. So they actually made a special provision and created an environmental court where judges really understand the implications of this. I think I will stop here. There's a lot I can say, but guys, you should have time to talk to.
You're in the middle.
I'm in the middle, sitting on the fence. Many more questions than I think we have time to answer, but just picking up on the education idea for a minute, and also trying to answer, what do we do to, in this situation? How do developed countries, consumers, or consuming nations have an impact out there if consumption is part of the problem, right? It's sort of the way I heard you say it. Look, I think the fundamental reality is that the world of fisheries is still the Wild West, right? It's the Wild West out there. And that's why the governance issue is so important. And so then you think, okay, governance, what do we mean by governance? We have a fairly well-established rule system, right? And there aren't even that many countries that haven't signed up to it one way or another. We've got the rules, we've got the traffic lights, right? But we all know that people stop at traffic lights for two really important reasons. One of them is that they might get caught if they go through, right? And we do need a lot more police. I mean, we need, and police means information, and it means all the vessel registry system that Karen was talking about is supremely important. And I want to just put in a plug for the fishing subsidies negotiations again. One of the key conditionalities that we are looking for as a condition that is appropriate for the WTO to put on the right to subsidize is you better participate in the system that she was talking about, and the vessels you subsidize better be on that registry, right? Better be participating in this. So information access to the regulators. But going back to the education thing, the reason most of us stop at red lights is because our mothers taught us to do it. And we are still really in a world where the consciousness of the dimensions of this crisis aren't it's not there, right? And so policymakers, including in developed countries and developing countries, really haven't grappled yet with the urgency of this. And so in an industry which is characterized by being diffuse, relatively invisible because so much of it happens far from shore, heavily corrupt in many parts of the world. And the corruption, you can't get past its real importance. What goes on when these two boats line up next to each other just outside an EEZ or inside the EEZ. So information flow, consciousness building, much more than rules is where I would put the efforts on governance.
And I would just add to that. I mean, governance works both ways. It's not just developing countries that have to get their systems in place. It's the developed countries, and it's as key that the U.S., which has a very good system for fisheries coming into the country, the customs officers that work here, who can actually identify most of the fish products that are coming in. Well, it's very important that there's somehow some sharing of that information so that when a boat pulls into Maputo Harbor in Mozambique and says that it has on board Greenland halibut, and the one fisheries inspector for the entire port has no idea what a Greenland halibut is, let alone what the filleted version of a Greenland halibut looks like, that there's some kind of sharing of information and support for that. I mean, that, it's the Barney saying, sharing is caring. I mean, it's trite, but on the issue of monitoring, control, and surveillance for fisheries, it is so core to everything that's going to happen. And it's part of the responsibility of the developed or importing countries in making access agreements, in importing those fish, to not only be requiring environmental and safety standards and sanitary standards, but also to be providing the countries that they're sourcing with some of that information. And the point was made about the private sector. It's not the countries that own the boats. but the countries are the ones that enforce the rules that apply to those boats. And the fishing industry can be incredibly influential in determining whether those rules are applied or not applied. And that's, I guess, gets into the legal issues as well. And I'm happy to talk about ITLOS offline a bit. And I see that Harlan Cohen is here from IUCN and Dorothy Zwibick as well. You've had a lot of experience with this. I mean, it goes back to one of the issues I raised before. There's no definition of a genuine link between a fishing vessel and its flag. There are countless cases of a vessel owned by Spanish capital, for example, flagged to Belize, fishing in the South Atlantic, and never having to go to port because they transship at sea to a vessel that then takes that fish to China, where value is added to it and it's breaded and it lands up in Europe. The paper trail, the ship-to-shelf trail of all those things is virtually non-existent. And that's where ITLOS, which could be one of the strongest mechanisms that we have to get countries to take action, doesn't get the teeth because it's undermined at the lower levels. So where you had, for example, the prompt release issue of a vessel, I can't remember where it was flagged to, but in the Southern Ocean that Australia arrested or that was catching bluefin tuna. And the argument is the fish is going to go off, you need to release the vessel. You can't actually say, again, it comes to unregulated fishing. The vessel is flagged to a country that is not a party to a regional fisheries management organization or to the law of the Law of the Sea Convention's fish stocks agreement. The rules don't apply. They're not illegal, they're unregulated, and they're taking advantage of those rules, and there's not very much that ITLOS can do about that. So we need to hone in on some of those key issues and get them sorted out so that it doesn't matter whether that country is a party to the Regional Fisheries Management Organization, that countries can take action because those vessels shouldn't be there. And I know that IUCN is working at the moment with the World Bank on establishing this vessel database, which is, I think, going to be one of the really huge resources that we have in taking these issues forward. And for advocacy groups, being able to say, if we have a huge database as Greenpeace, every time any of our ships go anywhere, we record every vessel we see. Now, if we could take those vessels, go to a one-stop shop, look it up, see that actually this vessel has infringed X, Y, and Z law in various places and shouldn't be fishing there at all, it takes 3 seconds to phone up an enforcement agency. You get Coast Watch groups doing the same thing, having the access to that information, and immediately you up the ante. And the Wild West changes. The rules, the stoplight, there's someone watching, there's a camera, and then speeding is not so, or stopping at the stoplight becomes a more risky venture. And that's part of what we need to ensure happens.
Okay. I'm afraid we need to leave it there. We've in fact gone on, but it's been such a rich discussion. I felt we really needed to. Please join our panelists for really terrific presentations and great discussion. So thank you very much.